Story 1: Salted herring and hard bread, daily meals on Viking ships. The wind picked up along the fjord, salt spray drifting into the air as wide-beamed longships groaned at the shore. Ropes were loosened. Men barked commands. Oars were set against the hulls. But among all the action there was a quieter concern at hand: food. You might picture the Vikings as fearless raiders and rugged seafarers, but before they plundered monasteries or colonized far-flung isles, they had to pack lunch. And that task, mundane, methodical, and essential, was more intricate than one might imagine. You're on a Viking ship now. Perhaps you're sitting next to a thick-bearded farmer from Rogaland. He smells faintly of goat milk and peat smoke. His cloak is wool, scratchy but warm. He nods a silent greeting and hands you a bite of dried fish. It's hard as oak bark. Let's slow down and examine what that bite actually meant. What did they eat? The Viking diet, particularly at sea, was about survival, not satisfaction. Their voyages spanning from Iceland to Constantinople could stretch for weeks or months, depending on wind, storms, and how frequently they raided or traded. So what food could survive such journeys? Hardtack, or ship's bread. Made from coarse rye or barley flour, this bread was baked until it resembled something between a brick and a bone. It didn't mold easily. It didn't crumble. You had to dunk it into water, beer, or stew just to bite through it. Salted or dried fish, often herring or cod. Abundant along Scandinavian coasts, fish were split, cleaned, and either air-dried on racks or heavily salted in barrels. Fish could last weeks if kept dry. Cod especially became a kind of protein currency. Smoked meats. Pork was smoked over juniper and alder wood. Fatty cuts were preferred: high calories, long shelf life. Sausages made with offal and oats were also smoked and strung together like ropes. Skyr, a yogurt-like dairy product. While not widely portable, hardened versions of skyr or cheese were sometimes brought along, especially on shorter trips or for use within the first few days. Ale and mead. Safer than water, which could easily go stagnant in barrels. Ale was weak but filled with calories. Mead, fermented honey wine, was a luxury but occasionally included for trade or morale. Onions, garlic, and herbs. These were included both for seasoning and health. Vikings believed garlic warded off illness. While fresh vegetables wouldn't last, dried versions or pickled roots might. Cooking on the sea. Contrary to popular imagination, Viking longships had no galley, no kitchen. Fires on board were rare and dangerous. Instead, most food was consumed cold. Meals were repetitive, boring, dry, and yet they were deeply essential to the journey's success. There were only two real ways to cook during a voyage. Wait for land. Meals were sometimes postponed until landfall. Even a brief stop along a rocky shore allowed for a fire, hot porridge, or soup. This often meant skipping meals for days if storms kept them from landing. Stoneware and soapstone pots. On rare occasions, a portable fire pit made of sand and stones might be used on calm seas, especially on merchant ships. But this was risky and generally reserved for longer, safer voyages. Storage and preservation. Storage was as crucial as preparation. If food spoiled, it wasn't just a minor setback, it could spell mutiny or starvation. Barrels and casks. Viking ships were packed with barrels of dried goods, salted meats, and weak ale. A 20-man crew could easily go through a dozen barrels in 2 weeks. Animal bladders. For small quantities of dairy, oils, or honey, cured animal bladders were used as watertight containers. Wool-lined sacks. Grain and dried peas were stored in tightly woven wool bags, sometimes tarred to resist moisture. Even the Vikings' method of salting was calculated. Salt wasn't cheap, it was produced through evaporation or mined. Thus, they salted just enough to preserve and often resalted during the journey if spoilage threatened. The psychological toll. Now imagine it's week 3. The rain has returned. The wind howls. The oarsmen row in shifts. You've had nothing but dried fish and hardtack for 11 days. The ale is sour. Your cloak is never dry, and you dream not of gold or conquest but of warm stews and soft bread. This is where Viking resilience was forged, not just in battle but in the slow gnaw of hunger, in the patient, monotonous chewing of the same stale rations. Food was more than sustenance, it was discipline, order, ritual. A man who saved his last bite of pork for the night watch did so knowing it might keep him from falling asleep. Another who shared his last hardtack might be honored for weeks. There were quiet rules, silent gratitude, mutual survival. A moment to reflect. You lean back now against the damp boards of the ship, the sea a soft rhythm beneath you. Around you the crew has gone quiet. The stars peek through the clouds. A gull calls in the distance. You wonder, how did they keep going? How did they endure this mix of hunger and hope? And most of all, what happened when the food finally ran out? There is a moment, halfway through the sea crossing, when the barrels grow lighter, the sacks less full, and the hardtack rations are counted more carefully. This is the phase of the voyage where every bite becomes a calculation. As you sit among the crew of this Viking longship, rocking gently in the North Sea, you begin to notice subtle shifts. No one eats alone anymore. Food is not casually shared. Men speak less during meals. They count out dried peas in their palms before boiling them into a meager porridge. The cook, if you could call him that, now opens barrels only when 3 others are watching. The food is running low. But this is not uncommon. Rationing and responsibility. Viking crews had an informal but practiced sense of rationing. Leadership fell to the ship's steersman, not just the helmsman, but also the commander of the voyage. His authority extended to everything, especially food. On long trips, the steersman would appoint 1 or 2 men to oversee provisions. These food men were responsible for tracking barrels opened and closed, reporting spoilage, distributing fair shares, particularly for high-value items like smoked pork or ale. Fairness mattered deeply. Food disputes could fracture crews. A man who hoarded dried fish might find himself thrown overboard. Theft of rations was rare, but when it occurred, it was treated as an offense nearly equal to treachery. Salt, hidden power. Salt wasn't just a preservative, it was a form of power. Not everyone on board understood how salting worked, but they all recognized its magic. A fish salted well could last a month. A poorly preserved one might rot in a week. Salt levels in the barrels were adjusted on the fly. If spoilage began, meat or fish was sometimes soaked in brine again or repacked. Some crews carried extra salt stones, large, chalky hunks scraped from coastal cliffs or traded for inland. When soaked in water, they produced an intensely salty solution used to rescue borderline meat. On wealthier voyages, especially those with merchant purposes, there might even be vinegar or ale vinegar, used to pickle fish or onions mid-journey. This was a luxury and sign of careful planning. Foraging along the way. Most Viking voyages hugged coastlines whenever possible. This wasn't just for navigation, it was for survival. Every shoreline was a potential larder. Crews might land to gather mussels, clams, or limpets along tidal rocks. Pick sea kale or wild onions from coastal meadows. Hunt seabirds, fish in rivers, or trap small game like rabbits. Boats carried nets, hooks, and fish spears for this purpose. If weather permitted, a quick campfire meal would be made. Mussels boiled with herbs, perhaps with a little smoked meat to flavor the broth. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm and welcome. These impromptu meals broke the monotony of dried rations. They lifted morale. Still, such landings were rare luxuries, and weather or enemy shores often prevented them. Hunger and desperation. But when land couldn't be reached, and when the barrels finally scraped empty, things turned quiet. Most Viking crews planned for such emergencies with what they called nodfod, emergency food. This might include dried peas or beans sealed in beeswax sacks, malt flour for mixing with seawater and boiling into an unappetizing paste, suet balls, lumps of animal fat mixed with oats or herbs, hard as stone but calorie-dense. These foods were reserved for the worst-case scenarios. Eating them signaled something was wrong. And when those ran out, then came the true hardship. Did the Vikings starve? In some cases, yes. Historical sagas speak cryptically of the sea taking more than it gave. While sagas often emphasize storms or shipwrecks, archaeological evidence suggests starvation was not uncommon. Excavations of ship burial and coastal campsites have revealed half-eaten animal bones burned black from desperation cooking. Human bones with signs of marrow extraction, though this remains debated. Soil layers rich in fish bones and scales, clustered in isolated fire pits, indicating over-reliance on shoreline foraging. There are no written Viking ship logs, no exact ration lists, but from comparisons with other medieval sailors, it's likely that a crew of 30 needed at least 90 pounds of food per day. Most longships carried only 2-3 weeks of full provisions. Voyages from Norway to England or Ireland could last 10-18 days longer if the winds failed. This meant even the best prepared ships danced at the edge of scarcity. Hunger and decision-making. Hunger did more than sap strength, it reshaped strategy. Captains delayed attacks if the crew was weak. Some diverted their routes toward known farms or settlements for quick raids, not for gold, but for grain. One saga from the 11th century mentions a detour made for bread and barley, not fame. Another tells of a crew who split up, half marching inland to hunt while the others waited at a cove. The inland group never returned. These quiet, unsung moments, the turn toward shore for onions, the extra pinch of salt in a barrel mattered as much as swords and shields. The animal passengers. To fend off hunger, some ships brought live animals. Goats or sheep, lashed securely and fed on dried grass. Chickens kept in wicker cages for both eggs and meat. Dogs, though rarely eaten, occasionally served as food of last resort. But animals took space. They needed care. They added weight. Only the richest expeditions could afford such luxuries, and only for shorter voyages. A glimpse from the sagas. In the saga of Eirik the Red, there's a brief, almost forgettable line. They drank broth made of old bones and seaweed, and they sang no songs for 3 days. It's easy to skip over, but it reveals everything. Old bones meant they boiled previous meals again and again, drawing out every last trace of fat or protein. Seaweed, likely gathered from a nearby shore, served as filler. And the silence, no songs for 3 days, tells of exhaustion, not just of body, but of spirit. A ship floating in silence. You sit now in that silence. Your ship has not seen land for a week. The wind has dropped. The sea is calm, but no one smiles. The salted fish is gone. The ale has turned. Your neighbor unwraps a pouch of emergency suet, bites it like a rock. Someone suggests sailing closer to the coast, though it will add 2 days to the journey. Others worry the shore is unfriendly. A village might resist, or worse, be empty. Still, empty bellies vote loudest. And so, the longship turns slowly toward a distant shadow of land. But will it offer food, or more silence? The coastline appears as a dull silhouette in the early mist, barely a smudge between sea and sky. There's no cheer when it is spotted, just a shared, quiet nod. Everyone is too hungry for celebration. You sit among the crew, silent, sore, your cloak clinging damp to your shoulders. All thoughts of gold or raiding are suspended. There is only one question now: will there be food? This is the final part of the journey, the moment where Viking voyages either ended in relief or desperation. Shorefall a brief respite. Landfall, when achieved, brought its own rituals. Crews did not rush ashore. They sent scouts first. If it was a known harbor or a friendly coastal settlement, then the entire crew might disembark. Fires would be lit quickly, driftwood if available or peat bricks if carried. Stew pots, packed deep in the hull, were uncovered. And the cooking began. A typical first hot meal after weeks at sea might include pea porridge boiled with dried onions or leek, salt pork stew if any meat had survived the voyage, stone-ground grain gruel thickened with animal fat or ale, occasionally a foraged fish or bird roasted simply. There was no feasting, not yet, just cautious, slow nourishment. Eating too quickly after starvation could kill. They knew this, even if not by modern nutritional science, then by grim experience. They ate slowly, chewed deliberately, let warmth return not just to their bellies but to their minds. When the shore was safe. Of course, not every shore offered safety. In many cases, particularly in the early raids of the 8th and 9th centuries, Viking ships arrived in hostile lands. The crews had to weigh the danger of attack against the certainty of hunger. If the shore was inhabited, and if the people seemed weak or poorly defended, the Vikings might raid not for silver, but for barley, pigs, and ale. The monastery at Lindisfarne, famously sacked in 793, was not just looted for religious treasure. Accounts tell of food stores being taken, livestock slaughtered, and grain removed from cellars. To hungry sailors, even sacred halls became pantries. To trade or take. Not all voyages were raiding missions. Many were merchant expeditions. When such ships approached foreign shores, particularly in the east, toward the lands of the Rus and Byzantium, they brought trade goods, not weapons. They offered furs, walrus ivory, and amber in exchange for wheat, dates, cheese, and olive oil. Bartering was slow and deliberate. Salted cod for waxed fruits, bear skins for sacks of grain, whale bone for wine. These trades were more than economic. They were survival strategies. The food taken in trade would fill the return voyage. Men spoke different languages, but hunger translated well. There are records from Arab geographers, such as Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who observed Norse traders along the Volga River. He wrote with distaste of their hygiene, but with curiosity about their methods. He noted the importance they placed on food, how deals stalled over the weight of grain or the quality of goat cheese. Preparing for the return journey. Once fed and resupplied, the crew turned to a new concern: how to prepare for the way home. They had eaten much of their stock. Some barrels were now used to hold new grain or salted local fish. Others were patched, cleaned, and filled with beer or pickled vegetables. The crew spent a full day packing provisions, sharpening blades, and often overlooked repairing sails and boots. Food may have been the first priority, but the ability to sail efficiently impacted how much food they needed. A torn sail meant slower speeds, more days at sea, more meals needed. A broken oar might leave them circling instead of landing. Hunger shaped every decision, even logistical ones. Tools and cooking implements. On land, Viking crews finally used the full extent of their cooking tools. These often included soapstone pots, heat-retaining and crack-resistant; iron cauldrons, rare and heavy but durable; wooden trenchers, reused and cleaned with sand; spits and skewers for roasting small game. The flavor of smoke clung to everything. Cooking fires burned with driftwood, peat, or dried dung, depending on the region. Meals were not spiced, save for the occasional hint of dill, garlic, or wild mustard. Still, after weeks of dry chewing, the mere warmth of a cooked stew was worth more than treasure. Memory and morale. These meals, simple, even bland, became stories. Later, when men returned to their home villages, they would not speak only of battles or strange lands. They would speak of the time the dried peas sprouted in the bag, of the gull that was caught by hand, of the time a shipmate boiled his own leather belt for soup. They laughed later, but not at the time. This was the true test of Viking resilience, not steel but stomach. Even in the sagas, great warriors are remembered not just for combat, but for enduring the lean crossing or sharing the last of the dried sausage. The cycle repeats. Sooner or later, the ship would be ready to depart again. The wind waited, the sea never rested long. And once more they would sail out, barrels refilled, stomachs steady, knowing full well what awaited them: repetition, dryness, cold, silence, perhaps hunger again. They prepared anyway. This was the way of Viking voyages, cyclical, enduring, unchanging even as the world around them shifted. They did not ask for comfort, only survival. Archaeological footnotes. Modern archaeology gives us glimpses into this silent side of Viking life. In Greenland, dig sites have yielded charred fish bones, still coated in salt crystals; wooden food barrels, staved and reinforced with iron hoops; rope-tied bundles of dried herbs, found under floorboards. In Iceland, early settlements show kilns built just for drying fish, their stones blackened with soot. And at ship burials in Norway and Sweden, food offerings are common: cured meats, grain sacks, small cheese wheels wrapped in birch bark. Even in death, they brought food for the journey. A quiet reflection. The fire dies low now. You sit with the crew, bellies full for the first time in weeks. The stew was plain, the bread hard, but it was enough, more than enough. You gaze toward the stars, thinking not of raiding or sailing, but of the simple taste of warmth on your tongue, the ache of hunger fatting. And you wonder, was this what drove them onward? Not gold, not conquest, but just a full meal beneath the sky. Was survival the real saga all along? Story 2. Boiled boots and iced tea. What Shackleton's men ate in Antarctica. It begins with white, an endless white so flat and vast that the horizon blurs with the sky. There is no sun, only a dull, drifting glow. The wind never stops. It doesn't howl, it hisses, a constant searing presence that steals heat and hope in equal measure. You're not in a ship anymore, not really. You're standing on a slab of shifting sea ice in the Weddell Sea in January of 1915. The wooden ship Endurance, trapped in thickening ice for months, groans like a dying tree. Around you, 27 other men work with silent precision, eyes squinting into the cold, breath forming ice in their beards. You're hungry. Everyone is hungry. Who were Shackleton's men? The Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, led by Sir Ernest Shackleton, set out in 1914 with a bold goal: to cross the Antarctic continent from sea to sea. The plan was ambitious, but the ice had other ideas. By early 1915, the Endurance became locked in pack ice, immobile and helpless. Shackleton and his 27-man crew, along with 69 sled dogs and a ship's cat, faced a new mission: survival. And that survival, above all else, depended on what they had brought to eat. What did they bring? Shackleton's men were well prepared for a normal expedition. Their initial stores included canned meats, tins of ox tongue, mutton stew, roast beef; bovril, a concentrated beef extract used for soup or warm drinks; hard biscuits, tough, dry, and durable, packed with calories but little taste; sledging rations, compressed bricks made of pemmican, a mix of dried meat and fat, cocoa and sugar, designed to provide maximum energy in small servings; dried vegetables, mostly potatoes, peas, and onions, often powdered; tea and cocoa powder, essential not just for warmth but for morale; condensed milk, a luxury at the time, used to stretch out tea or porridge; salt, pepper, mustard powder, minimal but meaningful. They had plenty for a voyage. But when Endurance became icebound, and later crushed by pressure ridges in October 1915, their planned journey ended. They salvaged what they could and camped on the ice. What had been intended as expedition rations became long-term survival supplies. Eating on the ice. Once the ship was abandoned, the crew set up camp a cluster of tents on a drifting floe. There were no stoves, no fresh food, no shelter beyond canvas and salvaged planks. Cooking took place over Primus stoves, compact kerosene burners prone to clogging in the cold. Fuel became a daily concern. Without heat, even melting snow for drinking water was a challenge. The daily meals became heartbreakingly repetitive. Breakfast, biscuit, bovril, or tea, and occasionally a spoonful of porridge. Lunch, more biscuits, and a mug of hot water or hoosh. Dinner, hoosh again made from pemmican, crushed biscuits and water. Hoosh was the mainstay, a stew of meat, fat, and grain, warm, greasy, and bland but vital. The men joked about it, called it dog's delight, but they ate every drop. The dogs. At first, Shackleton's dogs were valued teammates. The men gave them names Samson, Nelson, Snowball, and treated them well. But as the weeks passed and the ice drifted northward, food ran low. The decision was made. Some dogs would be culled for meat. It was not taken lightly. The men wept when the dogs were led away. But the meat was essential: fresh protein, fat, and warmth. Dog meat stews were never mentioned directly in diaries, but euphemisms abound. Fresh meat, special dinner, unexpected stew. They rarely wrote the word dog. It was too difficult. Boiling the boots. By April 1916, nearly 15 months after becoming trapped in the ice, the men reached Elephant Island, a desolate, wind-lashed rock in the Southern Ocean. They were emaciated, frostbitten, and running out of food. They had eaten all the dogs, all remaining canned goods, all biscuit reserves, even the seal blubber they had managed to gather en route. At one point, they attempted to boil their leather boots, hopping to soften the glue and extract a kind of broth. It tasted, one man noted, like despair. Iced tea and other ironies. One of the few pleasures left was tea. Despite everything, the men still rationed their tea leaves, steeping them multiple times, sometimes using melted ice water or snow. Even lukewarm, bitter, and weak, it was a psychological comfort. They called it iced tea, laughing at their own misfortune. Morale mattered. The act of sitting down, even on a rock or frozen crate, and sharing a meal brought a sense of routine, of humanity. In the most extreme environment on Earth, the ritual of eating, however meager, became the thing that held the group together. Improvisation. Shackleton's crew became resourceful with every crumb. Seal bones were boiled and reboiled, extracting marrow and fat. Penguin meat, when found, was roasted and stored, but never tasted good. Mold scraped from tent flaps was examined to see if it was edible. Fish frozen in the ice, sometimes caught by accident, were consumed whole. They used biscuit tins as pots, tin lids as plates, and animal skins as makeshift insulation. Nothing was wasted, not a drop, not a bone, not a breath. A portrait in endurance. You sit now on Elephant Island, wind howling past your ears, a crust of ice in your beard. The others sit beside you in a half circle, backs turned to the wind, holding tin mugs close. Tonight's meal: 2 spoonfuls of boiled seal meat, half a biscuit, and weak tea. You're still alive. That counts. A final thought. Food in these conditions was not just fuel. It was identity, hope, defiance. To eat even a mouthful of hoosh was to say, we are still here. But how much longer could they last? And what would it take to escape this frozen prison? The tents on Elephant Island groaned in the wind. Canvas cracked like whips. Ice crystals clung to mustaches and eyelashes. The men huddled close beneath salvaged sails and makeshift shelters, their bodies curled like parentheses against the cold. There was no food left, not really, just scraps, bone dust, one last biscuit per man. And so Shackleton decided. He would take a small crew, board a modified lifeboat, and attempt the impossible. A journey across 800 miles of the world's roughest ocean, the South Atlantic, in a 22-foot wooden boat named the James Caird. Why? To bring back food, fire, a ship, a future. But before any of that, they had to eat, or at least try. The James Caird set sail. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and 5 men pushed off into the Weddell Sea, rowing through slush, spray, and fear. On board they brought 6 weeks of rations, carefully measured and repacked, 2 sacks of hard biscuits, a few tins of pemmican, some lard for heat and energy, a tiny supply of tea and sugar, 1 Primus stove, and a few gallons of kerosene, a single pot battered and blackened. No fresh food, no medical supplies beyond lint and whiskey. Each man was allowed 2 biscuits per day, broken into halves and eaten slowly. Their fingers trembled from cold and hunger as they chewed. Water was melted ice if the stove worked. If not, they ate snow. Whoosh on the high seas. Life aboard the James Caird was a wet, shivering ordeal. Waves crashed over the sides. Salt water soaked their clothes and froze. Their sleeping bags were never dry. Cooking became a tactical operation. To make hoosh, 1 man cradled the Primus stove inside the upturned cover of a biscuit tin. Another shielded it with his body, keeping wind off the tiny flame. A few spoonfuls of pemmican were dropped into the pot, with water or melted snow. Biscuit crumbs or lard might be added luxuries. This thin gruel was passed around the 6 men. No seconds, no talking. Just silent chewing, slurping, eyes closed, steam rising into the frost-laden air. They rationed it carefully. If 1 stove flare-up failed, they might lose an entire day's food. The calories of survival. Each man consumed about 1,000 to 1,200 calories per day, less than half what they burned while enduring freezing temperatures and constant exposure. Their bodies began consuming themselves. Fat disappeared first, then muscle, then clarity of thought. 1 man, Frank Worsley, wrote in his diary that each wave seems made of knives, and that he dreamed of hot gravy every night. Shackleton encouraged them to focus on small goals, 1 mile at a time, 1 meal at a time. Even a spoonful of hoosh became an anchor for the mind. Reaching South Georgia. After 16 days at sea, battered by hurricane-force winds and with their rations nearly exhausted, the James Caird struck land South Georgia Island, home to a whaling station. They could see it, smell the peat fires, almost hear voices. But they were on the wrong side. A mountainous spine of snow-covered peaks stood between them and salvation. Shackleton again made the impossible choice: climb it, cross it, reach help. Crossing the mountains without food. Shackleton took 2 men, Worsley and Tom Crean, and began the 36-hour nonstop march across the mountains of South Georgia. They carried a coil of rope, a small tin of biscuits, 3 total, a Primus stove with just enough fuel for 1 boil. There were no maps, no rest, no time. They slid down icy slopes, climbed ridges in the dark, walked until their legs buckled. At one point, they made a fire and shared 1 biscuit each. They dipped the last of their tea into melted snow, sipped slowly, and kept moving. Crean later said that biscuit tasted like everything good I ever knew. Rescue and return. Shackleton reached the whaling station on May 20, 1916, emaciated, frostbitten, and wild-eyed. But he had made it. Over the next 4 months, after multiple failed attempts blocked by sea ice, he finally returned to rescue the 22 men still on Elephant Island. Miraculously, no one had died. They had survived on boiled seal meat, which they stretched thin, blubber and oil, sometimes drunk for calories, biscuit crumbs crushed and made into pastes. The memory of meals. The final rescue ship brought fresh bread, salted beef, tea, warm soup. The men wept. One refused to eat for hours. He simply held the bowl and breathed in the smell. What the diaries reveal. Though their journals were restrained Victorian men, after all they are filled with small moments of longing. Frank Wild, left in command on Elephant Island, wrote of one biscuit each man, the last. We toasted it over blubber flame, shared stories of roast mutton. Thomas Ordleys wrote, we boiled old socks to warm our hands. Even amid hunger, dignity remained. They scraped clean their bowls, not just for hunger, but for pride. Hunger and leadership. Shackleton's genius wasn't just in planning or navigation. It was in understanding morale through food. He never ate more than his men. He distributed rations equally. And when a man was weak, he gave him extra from his own portion quietly, without announcement. Food became a language, a form of command, of hope, of courage. ZZZ, a final thought. You close your eyes now. The wind has settled. Your ribs ache, but there's something in your hand, a warm tin cup filled with thin broth and floating biscuit crumbs. It's not enough, it never was. But it's something. You wonder how much can a person endure if each meal becomes a promise. And if hope itself has a flavor, was it not made of hot tea and pemmican? The sea was calmer than expected when Yelcho approached Elephant Island on August 30, 1916. A Chilean tugboat, small and shivering against the ice, it carried Sir Ernest Shackleton and a handful of men. After 4 failed rescue attempts, this 5th try had broken through the ice-choked waters of the Southern Ocean. On shore, the 22 men who had remained behind for 4 long months were gaunt, sunken-eyed, bearded shadows. Their clothing hung like rags. Their tents had deteriorated into patched holes. Their food stores, gone weeks ago. And yet they had survived. Now finally, there would be more than blubber broth and biscuit crumbs. The rescue ship brought more than safety. It brought bread. What they were eating before rescue. By late August, their rations had diminished into pure improvisation. Here is what the men on Elephant Island were still consuming. Seal meat, stewed and stretched until it was rubbery. Penguin meat, tough and oily, barely palatable. Blubber, rendered into soup or chewed raw for fat. A few biscuit fragments, saved and savored like relics. Boiled seaweed, gathered from coastal rocks when tides allowed. When storms kept them from foraging, they would simply not eat. The men took turns melting snow for water, eating in silence, taking comfort only in the slow, shared act of survival. One diary entry from Frank Wild reads simply, we are all very thin. The seal meat no longer satisfies, but spirits are oddly high. We have passed into something beyond hunger. The first real meal. When the Yelcho arrived, the men didn't cheer. They stood and stared. Then slowly, they raised their hands and waved. On board, steaming broth and fresh bread were waiting, prepared by the Chilean crew. Shackleton, before even speaking, handed out food. One recalled, I held the bread like a sacred object. It was soft, warm. I cried without knowing it. They didn't gorge. Shackleton made sure of that. He warned them to eat slowly. Starved bodies can reject sudden food. And so they nibbled, took sips of soup, blinked in the sunlight. It wasn't just the food, it was the warmth, the flavor, the idea that this could be regular again. The psychological impact of prolonged hunger. For many of the men, the hunger didn't stop when the eating resumed. Some had developed permanent stomach issues, sensitive to fats or unable to digest grains properly. Others suffered from insomnia, still waking in the night expecting hunger pangs. Several experienced food hallucinations well after their return to civilization. Dreams of roasted meats, bowls of custard, fried eggs. And others found food confusing. One, after arriving in Punta Arenas, refused a steak, whispering, "It's too much. It'll disappear." Letters and diaries, the aftertaste of Antarctica. The story of endurance was publicized after their return, but many of the men's personal notes speak more softly, not of glory or survival, but of food. Some excerpts. "The taste of Bovril still haunts me. I think I love it more now." Tom Crean. "I dream of soup. Not women, not gold, just soup." Leonard Hussey. "To eat a biscuit without wind on your face is the greatest of all luxuries." Frank Worsley. They had become poets of rations. Legacy, what Shackleton taught about food. Shackleton's expedition is still studied in leadership courses, polar training schools, and disaster survival programs. His strategies on morale and nutrition are core to his legend. Here, what he modeled. Equity in food distribution. No matter a man's rank or skills, all received the same ration. This built trust. Control and routine. Meals were structured even if meager. Predictability soothed fear. Morale through small indulgences. Shackleton saved sugar, tea, and biscuit fragments for low days. A few extra sips of cocoa at the right time lifted despair. Self-sacrifice. Shackleton routinely gave his portions to the weakest men, quietly. That example cascaded throughout the crew. In a place where nothing grew, where every calorie had to be carried or caught, food became the leader's most powerful tool. Aftermath, returning to the world of plenty. When the men returned to England, the world was at war. It was 1916. Rations, shortages, and hunger were also part of daily life at home. Some of the crew found this odd symmetry comforting, others found it cruel. Frank Wild eventually returned to the Antarctic, but never again would he eat pemmican. He once joked that he would rather eat his hat. Ernest Shackleton later launched another expedition, the Quest, but died of a heart attack in 1922. His body is buried in South Georgia, the island that saved them. His grave overlooks the icy bay where he landed, hungry and determined. A closing reflection. Imagine now, you're seated at a quiet table in a London cafe in 1917. It's raining outside. A bowl of soup rests before you, hot, thick, aromatic. You raise the spoon to your mouth. In that moment, are you truly full? Or does part of you still live on the ice, beside a blubber fire, sipping something far thinner but infinitely more sacred? Was it the food or the fight for it that fed the soul? Story 3. Ovens at Sea, Feeding Napoleon's Navy. It is the year 1805. Across the waters of the English Channel, two great naval forces sit in cold anticipation: Napoleon's French fleet and the Royal Navy of Britain. The French ships are heavier, older, and poorly provisioned. The British ones. They're hungry too, but more efficient. Both sides know this battle, if it comes, may not be won with cannon fire alone. Because war at sea begins with bread. And in Napoleon's navy, bread was more than a staple, it was a source of frustration, delay, and sometimes mutiny. You stand now aboard the Redoubtable, a 74-gun ship of the line, drifting in the Bay of Biscay. Below your feet, sailors murmur in the gloom of the lower deck. The barrels of salt pork have started to leak. The weevils in the biscuit barrels are stirring. And somewhere deep in the hold, a rat chews on the edge of a canvas sack. The real enemies of the French Navy weren't just the British. They were mold, corruption, and poor logistics. Let's take a look at what French sailors' matelots were actually eating. The rationing system. By Napoleonic decree, every French sailor was entitled to a daily ration, determined by naval commissaries and codified into law. On paper, it was generous. 750 g, of biscuit hard bread, 400 g of salted meat beef or pork, alternating days, 60 g of dried legumes, lentils or peas, 25 g of rice, 30 g of oil or lard, wine up to 3/4 liter per day when available, a small quantity of vinegar, salt, and dried vegetables. But this was on paper. In reality, Napoleon's fleet struggled to receive even half these rations during extended campaigns. Blockades, storms, underfunded suppliers, and corrupt port officials meant that food often arrived late, spoiled, or never at all. French sailors joked that their official ration list was the menu of a ghost. The bread problem. Bread, or more precisely, ship's biscuit, was the backbone of naval diets. Ship's biscuits were not soft loaves. They were more like bricks, flour, water, and salt baked multiple times until completely hard. A proper biscuit could last years in dry storage. Unfortunately, French naval bakeries often rushed the process. Poorly dried biscuits molded quickly. Worse, they attracted weevils, small, crunchy insects that nested in flour and multiplied in the dark corners of barrels. Sailors learned to tap their biscuit on the table, knocking out the bugs. Soak it in broth, vinegar, or wine to soften it. Break it with a hammer or rifle butt when it was too hard to bite. Still, sailors called it pain du diable, the devil's bread. And yet they ate it every day, twice a day. Meat, salted and suspect. Next to biscuit, the most common protein aboard was salted beef or pork. Meat was preserved in vast barrels filled with brine. A good barrel could last weeks. A bad one spoiled quickly, and spoiled meat could spark illness or revolt. Ship cooks, usually the least injured or most disliked sailors, boiled the meat in giant cauldrons called cambuses, adding peas, lentils, or a chopped onion when available. One recurring problem: brine saturation. Meat that soaked too long became inedibly salty, requiring hours of boiling. Some cuts were so dense with salt that sailors had to pound them with hammers before cooking. In particularly lean times, rats were consumed. Unofficially, of course. The role of the ship's cook. The cook, usually assisted by a handful of pressed men, prepared massive stews in single iron kettles lashed to the galley floor. Meals were always one-pot affairs. Everything went into the same boiling mass. Biscuit crumbs, old vegetables, meat, sometimes even bones for flavor. No one had personal utensils. Sailors ate communally from wooden bowls, using whatever they had: a spoon, a piece of bread, or just fingers. Cleanup was simple. Rinse the bowl in seawater, hang it to dry. Flavors were consistent. Most sailors developed a deep taste for vinegar, which helped cut through the fat and soften biscuit mush. Corruption and the commissariat. Perhaps the greatest challenge in feeding the French Navy wasn't weather or war, it was bureaucracy. Napoleon's naval commissariat was notoriously corrupt. Port officials routinely shorted deliveries, sold off naval provisions, or issued substandard supplies. In Toulon, a 1804 inspection found wine barrels filled with river water and vinegar, biscuit stores that were infested and blue with mold, beef barrels with rocks hidden beneath salted cuts to increase weight. Officers tried to report these issues, but paperwork moved slowly. By the time new supplies were authorized, the ships had sailed. In some cases, naval officers purchased food with their own money to feed their crews. In others, they turned a blind eye as men starved. This led to one of the most unusual sights in Napoleon's navy: ovens at sea, floating bakeries. In an act of desperate innovation, the French Navy began building floating bakehouses, large transport ships retrofitted with ovens, designed to follow fleets and bake bread at sea. They were manned by civilian bakers, who slept below hot iron ovens, constantly churning out ship's biscuit and crusty loaves. Each oven could bake 2,000 biscuits a day. They weren't fast enough. The demand was constant. Crews lined up for fresh bread. Most of it was re-dried and stored. Some was eaten on the spot, still warm, a rare luxury. But storms made baking dangerous. Fires broke out. In at least 2 cases, floating bakeries sank, their cargo of dough lost to the sea. Meals during battle. During actual combat, meals were forgotten. For 24 to 48 hours, sailors went without food. Cannon crews drank brandy or watered wine, chewing biscuit or strips of salted pork when possible. After battle, wounded sailors were fed broth, a thin mix of biscuit flour and beef fat. When rations were critically low, officers gave double wine rations instead of food, hopping to keep morale from collapsing. It worked occasionally. A pause below deck. You sit now in the gloom of the gun deck, back to a warm cannon, bowl in your lap. The soup is more water than food. Your biscuit is chipped. A weevil crawls across your sleeve, unbothered by your presence. But this is dinner. The man beside you hums an old Breton song. The lantern sways above. And you wonder how long can a ship fight if its belly is empty? What happens when the biscuits crumble? The scent of rot was always there. Deep in the lower decks of Napoleon's warships, the smell of salt, sweat, and rotting meat clung to the timber. Tar couldn't cover it. Vinegar couldn't wash it away. The ocean was cruel, but it was the provisions quietly going bad in the dark that truly broke the spirit of many sailors. By 1805, as French ambitions reached toward dominance of the seas, another, quieter battle was being fought not with broadsides or bayonets, but with barrels and bread molds. Let's step further below deck, where sickness fermented next to spoiled peas, and where bad food brought down morale faster than enemy fire. Rot in the hold. French ships often set sail with provisions packed into every crevice. Barrels of salted meat, stacks of biscuit sacks, and bundles of dried beans were jammed alongside gunpowder and rope. But the design of the ships worked against the food. Heat built up below deck, especially in the tropics, accelerating spoilage. Barrels swelled and cracked as the ship's motion loosened their bindings. Rodents and insects, stowaways from port, found meals faster than men did. Ventilation was poor. Even dried grains molded in high humidity. Sailors were expected to report spoiled food, but in practice, complaints were ignored or punished. Food wasn't thrown overboard. It was rationed anyway. You didn't ask if the pork was sour. You just chewed faster. Scurvy, diarrhea, and the doctor's tools. The biggest threat on long naval voyages wasn't cannon fire. It was scurvy. A vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy ravaged the gums, loosened teeth, and turned muscles to jelly. It was the direct result of weeks or months without fresh fruit or vegetables. British ships had adopted citrus juice rations by the late 1700s. The French. No official scurvy prevention policy existed until well into Napoleon's reign. Naval doctors recommended onions and vinegar, but these weren't always provided. Some ships carried dried vegetable cakes made from mashed carrots and leeks, but only in small quantities. When scurvy took hold, the ship's chirurgeon surgeon could do little. Bloodletting, mustard poultices, and vinegar rinses were tried. None worked. A typical crew might lose 10–15% of men to scurvy during long campaigns. Diarrhea and dysentery also ran rampant, triggered by spoiled meat or brackish water stored too long in wooden casks. A sailor with stomach cramps often had 2 choices: keep working or die quietly near the bilge. Black markets at sea. Despite Napoleon's rigid structure, black markets thrived aboard his ships. Sailors stole extra rations, hid food in hammocks, or traded favors for better cuts of meat. Powder boys, the youngest crew members, were often bribed with dried apples. extra spoonfuls of rice, pieces of soft bread when it was available. Even officers participated. A petty officer with access to the galley could skim the best biscuit tops, the ones without weevils, for himself or his favorites. Sailors developed a slang system to trade food under watchful eyes. Blue pane, bad bread. Akale, meat with scales, i.e. gone bad. Laban sell, high-quality salt used to preserve stolen meat. Hunger bred innovation and theft. Making do, recipes without a kitchen. French naval cooking lacked imagination but not desperation. Here are some of the meals sailors fashioned from nothing. 1. Soup du cochon, invisible pig soup. A bucket of hot water. A bone that had already been used 3 times. Crushed biscuit to thicken. Salt and dried mustard, if available. It tasted like floury pork air, but it was warm. 2. Toast au feu de lantern toast. A biscuit held close to a hanging lantern until slightly softened. Rubbed with lard or rat grease. Crackling, fatty, and vaguely warming. 3. Pâté de fond de barrel, bottom of the barrel pâté. Bits of salted pork fat and dried peas mashed together. Spread on biscuit. Some likened it to paste, others considered it a delicacy by week 5. Naval campaigns and starvation. The longer the fleet stayed at sea, the more likely starvation loomed. In the months before the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, French ships, blockaded in ports like Cadiz and Brest, saw their food stores rot faster than they could be replenished. Ship captains recorded increasing cases of weakness, desertion, and insubordination. One captain wrote, "They complain of bread with holes, of meat with worms. I remind them they are sailors." But hunger doesn't obey hierarchy. Some ships tried fishing to supplement rations. Others traded with local fishermen under cover of darkness, offering nails, rope, or musket balls for onions and eels. Still, many sailed into battle half-fed. At Trafalgar, Admiral Villeneuve's fleet was well-armed but poorly fed. His men were hungry, sick, and some historians argue barely strong enough to fight. Bureaucracy and the endless ledger. Back in Paris, the Naval Ministry processed thousands of supply forms, each listing quantities of flour, pork, dried peas, and vinegar. These records often lagged months behind reality. One ironic entry from 1806, filed after a major loss at sea, noted provisions for redoubtable 4,000 kg of biscuit en route. The ship had sunk 2 weeks earlier. A moment at sea. You sit near the helm, the wind slackening. The cook just passed out soup. It tastes strange. There was no meat today. You think the flavor might be cabbage, but there's no cabbage. A sailor beside you offers a crumb of his biscuit, almost soft. It is the kindest thing you've seen in days. And as you dip it in your soup, you wonder, what does victory taste like when the journey is lined with hunger? When meals feel like memory? The British blockade choked every French port like a slow, unrelenting tide. From Brest to Toulon, Napoleon's ships sat in harbors, their hulls swelling with salt, their sails slack, their men waiting for orders, for food, for anything. But the food never came, not fresh, not fast enough, and hunger, always patient, tightened its grip on the French Navy. This was not just a story of meals eaten or missed. It was the quiet unraveling of morale, one moldy biscuit at a time. And it ended, as many things did in Napoleon's wars, not with fire and glory, but with sickness, scarcity, and the weight of unmet expectation. The blockade, starvation by strategy. The British understood something Napoleon's admirals often ignored. An army may march on its stomach, but a navy floats on it. By implementing a near-continuous naval blockade of key French ports, the Royal Navy ensured that French supply ships couldn't leave harbor. Merchant fleets bringing grain from French colonies were intercepted. Fishing vessels were seized or destroyed. Port warehouses remained stocked with rot, not rations. French ships sat idle for months, with crews on half rations, then quarter. When finally sent to sea, the sailors were emaciated, sick, and demoralized, armed, yes, but barely able to lift a cannonball. Accounts from the edge. Letters and logs from this period tell a grim story. A first lieutenant in Toulon recorded, "I watched men break teeth on their biscuits. They are hollow now, filled with spiders." A midshipman wrote, "We had vinegar soup 3 nights in a row. It was hot water with a lie." One sailor, later captured by the British, told his interrogators, "We were already defeated before we left port. Our hunger fought harder than our guns." Some ships refused to set sail. In Rochefort, sailors rioted when they were asked to load cannon while eating rat broth and cabbage leaves boiled in seawater. Battle on an empty stomach. When Admiral Villeneuve's fleet finally left Cadiz in October 1805, they sailed toward Trafalgar not just underprepared, but underfed. Survivor reports from the Battle of Trafalgar tell of men fainting during cannon exchanges, too weak to reload guns, too dizzy to climb rigging. The Redoubtable, famous for her close-quarters duel with HMS Victory, fought valiantly. But inside, her decks were filled with half-starved men, many suffering from dysentery. One British boarding party later described the smell aboard as not of powder, but of spoiled pork and rotting feet. Hunger had already claimed them. They fought anyway. Aftermath: the survivors' diet. Captured French sailors, prisoners of war, often found themselves eating better in British captivity. In port cities like Plymouth and Portsmouth, French POWs received fresh bread, salted beef of better quality, dried beans and potatoes, weak ale or barley water. It wasn't luxury, but it was clean, it was edible. Ironically, some French sailors gained weight in British prisons after years of famine afloat. Others never recovered. France's reform comes too late. In the wake of the naval defeat at Trafalgar, the French Navy entered a long decline. Napoleon turned his attention to land battles, where logistics, while still difficult, were more controllable. But the Navy did try to adapt. New naval bakeries were established, with inspections to reduce mold and infestation. Canned food in its early forms was experimented with in port cities. Nicolas Appert, the French inventor of food preservation by bottling and heating, would later be rewarded by Napoleon for his ideas. Citrus rations were added to some long voyages, though never as consistently as in the British fleet. But the damage had been done. The sailor's belly had already decided the empire's fate. The forgotten supply ships. For every warship, there were dozens of store ships, often underprotected and rarely remembered. These vessels, laden with flour, pork, vinegar, and wine, rarely reached their destinations. Storms wrecked many. British ships seized others. Some were scuttled by their own captains to avoid capture. One such vessel, the Patience, was found years later washed ashore in Spain, its hold still full of salted beef, too hard even for rats. The cycle of naval hunger. This cycle played out again and again. Port rations were late or insufficient. Crews were sent out half-fed, hopping to resupply after initial success. Battles drained energy, and spoilage claimed the rest. Victory became impossible, even with superior guns or ships. Defeat meant imprisonment and often better meals. A quiet moment in the hold. You're back on the gun deck now. The lanterns are low, the soup pot is empty. Your hands are raw from salt and powder. Your mouth is dry from biscuit crumbs. There's no battle today, just gray skis and the thud of ropes against mast. You lie back, thinking not of strategy or emperors or glory, but of warm bread, of soup that isn't clear, of a meal where the meat doesn't flinch. and you wonder how many empires have fallen to something as quiet as hunger. Story 4. Pigeon Pie and Portable Soup, aboard the Mayflower. The year is 1620. In the cramped harbor of Plymouth, England, a creaking wooden vessel, the Mayflower, rocks gently in the late summer tide. Her hull is stuffed with barrels, sacks, and crates. Her decks are slick with brine. And in the belly of the ship, men and women huddle among their belongings, preparing not for battle, not for trade, but for something far more uncertain, a new life. Among the Pilgrim's most precious cargo, though often overlooked in tales of faith and freedom, is something far more mundane, far more perishable, and far more important: food. You sit now in the gloom of the lower deck, cross-legged beside a family from Leiden, a barrel of smoked fish between you. Children sleep curled up beside sacks of flour. A wooden spoon clatters across the planks as the ship shifts. There are no cooking fires, no warm ovens, no bakeries on board. So what will you eat for the next 66 days at sea? What did they bring? The Mayflower was not a passenger vessel. It was a merchant cargo ship, hastily refitted to carry 102 passengers and their supplies plus a crew of about 30. The Pilgrims planned for survival in a land they'd never seen. But first, they had to survive the Atlantic. Their provisions were stored in barrels, chests, and cloth sacks. And while records are incomplete, historians believe the foodstuffs aboard likely included ship's biscuit hardtack, dry rock-hard bread made from flour, salt, and water, long-lasting, difficult to chew; salted beef and pork, preserved in large barrels of brine; dried fish, cod, herring, and haddock, cured with salt or smoked; cheese, mostly hard, aged cheeses, cheddar, Cheshire, chosen for longevity; dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils; oatmeal and flour, for thickening stews or making simple porridge when possible; butter and suet, stored in waxed cloth or animal bladders; vinegar, used both for flavor and preservation; beer and cider, safer than water which turned foul quickly; portable soup, a thick gelatin made from boiled bones, reduced into cakes and dried, a kind of early bouillon cube. There were also small amounts of dried fruit, raisins, and prunes, and, for the lucky, preserved pies or cakes for special occasions. One account mentions pigeon pie, cooked before departure and intended to be eaten cold in the early days at sea. No fires allowed. Aboard ship, open flames were strictly forbidden except in the galley, and only the ship's cook could use them. Why? Fire risk. One stray spark could ignite ropes, sails, or pitch. Smoke in enclosed decks. Even a small fire could choke passengers. Fuel, wood was limited and needed for repairs, not cooking. Thus, meals for passengers were mostly cold or lukewarm. The Mayflower's cook prepared food only for the crew, not the colonists. Pilgrims had to rely on cold rations, salt meat and biscuit often eaten as is; soaked meals, hardtack soaked in cider, water, or broth if portable soup was dissolved; shared stews. Occasionally, trusted passengers might use the cook's fire to boil a communal pot. Cooking at sea was a matter of negotiation, luck, and ingenuity. Rats and insects. Food was not only shared among passengers. The Mayflower was infested with rats chewing through grain sacks and nibbling biscuit corners; weevils nesting in flour and biscuit barrels; lice and mites spread through blankets and food stores alike. Passengers tapped their biscuit before eating, listening for the telltale soft thud of bugs falling out. Meat was sniffed and poked for signs of slime or mold. If it didn't smell too bad, it was considered safe. Sometimes desperation overruled caution. Illness from spoilage. Foodborne illness was common. Without refrigeration or sanitation, passengers quickly encountered stomach ailments from spoiled meats and stagnant water; scurvy due to lack of fresh fruit or vegetables; dysentery, from contaminated containers or shared utensils. The Mayflower passengers had brought onions and garlic, known for their antibacterial properties, but these were limited and rotted quickly. Salt was a preservative, but it couldn't save everything. Even salted pork began to stink after weeks at sea. Eating as a family, starving as a group. Families clustered together in the hold, using shared wooden trenchers and common pots. There was no privacy. Meals were eaten in near darkness, with passengers crouched between trunks and sleeping mats. A small jug of cider was passed around. Biscuit was broken and soaked. Meat was divided into small pieces and chewed slowly. Meals were silent, not from reverence but from fatigue and nausea. Many passengers were seasick for days. Some never recovered. The strong helped the weak eat. Children were fed first. And every crumb was counted. What the journals say. William Bradford, who would later become governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote in of Plymouth Plantation. We did eat cold and sparse and yet gave thanks. The salt meat was often gray and sour, the biscuit hard and quick with life. Quick with life was a euphemism for infested. Another colonist, Edward Winslow, noted, we were thankful for the broth made of bone and the meal of oats soaked in cider. When it warmed us, we forgot the taste. A moment in the darkness. Now the lantern is out. The ship creaks in the wind. Rain hammers the deck above. Beside you, a mother whispers a prayer as she offers her child the last bite of cheese. You gnaw on biscuit, it cracks flavorless. Someone nearby retches into a bucket. Another prays for land, or sun, or both. And you wonder, if the food is this bad now, what will you eat when you arrive? What grows in a place you've never seen? What happens when the barrels are empty and the land is still sleeping? The wind shifts, the water calms. On the 65th day at sea, someone shouts from the crow's nest, land. Cape Cod, they say. Not Virginia, not the planned destination, but land nonetheless. As the Mayflower drifted into the cold Atlantic waters off what would later become Massachusetts, the passengers cheered quietly, not for victory, but for the possibility of something warm, something fresh, anything that didn't come out of a barrel. But food was still a problem, and the land ahead was wild, unfamiliar, and frozen. And so, in this strange middle place between hunger and harvest, between sea and settlement, the Pilgrims began the second phase of survival. Winter arrival, empty stores. When the Mayflower anchored in Provincetown Harbor on November 11, 1620, winter had already begun to settle over the New England coastline. The timing could not have been worse. No crops in the ground. No game prepared for winter hunting. No permanent shelter from the cold. And very little food remaining. Accounts suggest that most of the salted meat was gone or had turned. Barrels of grain and peas were nearly empty. Portable soup had been used weeks earlier. Hardtack biscuits remained, but were crumbling, moldy, and insect-ridden. The Pilgrims had arrived in the New World malnourished, seasick, and ill-prepared to feed themselves. They could not go back, but moving forward meant learning how to forage, hunt, and scrape whatever calories the land offered. Foraging in an unfamiliar land. The first expeditions ashore focused not on exploration or settlement, but on food. Small parties rode to shore and scouted the forests for nuts. They found some acorns, chestnuts, and beech nuts, although many had already been eaten by animals. Shellfish. Coastal inlets provided mussels, clams, and oysters easy to gather, but difficult to digest after months of stomach illness. Wild berries, most were withered by frost, some bitter, others unidentifiable and avoided. Roots and tubers. The colonists had no training in identifying edible wild plants. They dug blindly. One party discovered a stash of buried corn likely stored by a local Wampanoag group. They took it, Later, they would repay it, but in the moment, it meant survival. Hunting attempts and failures. Game was plentiful, but the pilgrims were not skilled hunters. Their matchlock muskets were heavy, slow to load, and inaccurate. Their armor and clothes made quiet movement difficult. Most had no experience with wilderness tracking or game preparation. Still they tried. A few wild turkeys were caught. Some ducks and geese were shot near the marshes, but the meat spoiled quickly without proper curing, and butchery was often clumsy. One journal notes, "We did kill a goose, and it gave broth most satisfying. The flesh was rough, but better than biscuit." Squirrels and small mammals were caught in makeshift traps. Bones were saved and boiled again and again until they yielded no more grease, just flavorless water. Salt and fire. Salt was scarce. With no salting houses or boiling pans, preservation of fresh food was impossible. This meant that all food had to be eaten quickly or lost. But firewood was also limited. Trees had to be chopped, dried, and burned. In wet conditions, this meant cold meals or none at all. So the settlers turned to what they knew. Biscuit soaked again in water. Small amounts of ground corn boiled into gruel. Leftover vinegar used to disguise spoiled broth. And in moments of scarcity, they simply fasted. Not for religious reasons, though prayers were said, but because there was nothing left to eat. The first winter, the starvation months. From December 1620 through March 1621, the colonists suffered what historians now call the starving time. Records show that more than half the passengers died that winter. Scurvy, pneumonia, and starvation worked in tandem. Some days, only 5 or 6 people were healthy enough to cook or bury the dead. Food diaries fall silent during this period. There are vague mentions of meal reduced to half, cold water and biscuit, and the broth of bones and roots. No one wrote about flavor. Just survival. William Bradford's account. Bradford later wrote, "Being in want, we did divide the last of our meal, and with it we made but one kettle, yet thanked God." In another entry he reflects, "We learned to boil grass and bark. The broth did warm us, though it filled us not." It's important to note that Bradford was not trying to dramatize. If anything, his tone is subdued, plain. Food, by this point, was not a narrative device. It was the entire story. Brain the mind of the hungry. Pilgrims began to experience the slow effects of chronic malnutrition. Fatigue and confusion. Irritability and fever. Hallucinations of warm meals, according to some second-hand accounts. One settler reportedly thanked a stump, believing it was a roast fowl. Another, delirious with hunger, tried to eat a candle. These moments were not recorded in detail, but they linger in oral tradition, quiet, sad, and strangely human. A night on shore. You rest now near the outline of a half-built hut. The fire is down to embers. In your lap, a bowl of gruel corn, water, and a pinch of salt. There is no meat, no butter, but it is warm. You sip slowly, knowing tomorrow it might snow again, knowing others are already gone. And you wonder, was this land really promised? Can the soil remember England? Can you plant hope in hunger? What grows when the food is gone? By April of 1621, the snow had begun to recede from the low hills beyond the pilgrims' clearing. The frozen earth, once as hard as iron, softened beneath the warming sun. Steam rose from damp soil. Small green shoots peeked up near the edge of the woods. And with them came something even more miraculous, the chance to eat again. The Mayflower's passengers, now barely half their original number, had made it through the first New England winter. Not with strength, but with stubbornness. Not on full bellies, but by passing spoons hand to hand, sharing broth made of bones and bark. Now at last it was time to plant. Help from the Wampanoag. Though the pilgrims were strangers to the land, they were not entirely alone. The Wampanoag people, who had lived on these lands for thousands of years, had watched the newcomers with caution and eventually compassion. A man named Tisquantum, commonly known as Squanto, became an unexpected ally. Fluent in English from years of captivity and travel, he taught the settlers how to grow food on unfamiliar soil. He showed them how to plant corn in mounds, each kernel nestled beside fish for fertilizer, how to grow beans to climb the stalks and squash to cover the soil, a system now called the Three Sisters, how to find edible plants like wild garlic, ramps, and Jerusalem artichokes, how to tap maple trees for sap, how to smoke and dry fish so it would last beyond the day's catch. It was not just food, it was knowledge, knowledge that saved lives. The first gardens. Planting began in late April and early May. Small plots were cleared by hand, tools were few, hands were blistered, and the settlers worked through grief and weakness. Each family planted what they could. Corn, gifted and traded from the Wampanoag. Turnips from salvaged seeds brought from England. Cabbage and carrots, although many seeds failed to germinate. Herbs like sage, thyme, and parsley if they survived the journey. There was no guarantee of harvest, but there was hope in every sprout. A young girl, Priscilla Mullins, reportedly named each corn mound after a family member she had lost. When they sprouted, she said, "They've come back to us." Fish, fowl, and foraging. As spring turned to summer, food began to appear in other forms as well. Fresh fish, cod, bass, perch caught in the bay and nearby rivers. Shellfish gathered easily at low tide, clams, mussels, and oysters. Wild berries, blueberries, strawberries, and blackberries. Game, rabbits, squirrels, and once again wild turkeys. And the forest held other secrets. Beech nuts and acorns, soaked and roasted to remove bitterness. Fiddlehead ferns, foraged by women and older children. Elder flowers and sumac, used for flavoring and gentle remedies. Still, it was a cautious abundance. Every piece of meat was dried or smoked. Every berry was dried on cloths in the sun. Nothing was wasted. They had learned brutally that hunger can return without warning. Cooking in the New World. With shelter and firewood more available, colonists could cook more regularly. Meals now included corn mush, dried corn ground into meal, boiled with water and salt. Fish stew, fish heads, herbs, and vegetables boiled in large kettles. Roasted fowl, geese or ducks, stuffed with wild onion and sage. Ash cakes, cornmeal flattened and cooked on hot stones or coals. There were still no ovens. Bread was rare, but warm food eaten while seated became a regular occurrence. For many, it felt like wealth. The first Thanksgiving. In autumn 1621, after the first successful harvest, Governor Bradford declared a day of feasting and gratitude. The details are sparse. The term Thanksgiving would not be used for years, but several accounts mention a 3-day gathering where colonists and over 90 Wampanoag shared. Venison brought by the Wampanoag. Roast waterfowl. Seafood, likely including eels and shellfish. Corn-based dishes. Stews and vegetable preparations. There was no pie, no sugar or ovens yet, no cranberry sauce, but there was laughter, there was warmth. And for the first time since the journey began, there was enough. Reflection in the writings. Bradford later wrote, "And by God's provision we are not starved. We have fish, corn, fowl. The bounty of the land is known to us now." Another settler noted, "It is not the food of England, but we have meat and root, and do give thanks for the fire that warms us and the broth that sustains." They had learned to live not by habit, but by adaptation. The lingering hunger. Still, even with food in the pot, memories of hunger lingered. Children flinched when food was dropped. Bread crusts were saved for days. Some settlers buried small caches of dried meat, afraid the winter would come again too quickly. One woman, Elizabeth Hopkins, reportedly taught her children to say grace not just before eating, but before preparing food, before foraging, even before planting. They knew what it meant to go without, and so every meal became sacred. One quiet evening. You sit now by a small fire, the scent of stew in the air. Your hands are no longer shaking. A bowl of corn and beans rests in your lap. You chew slowly, watching the flame dance. In the distance, someone sings. Children laugh, chasing each other with reed whistles. The woods beyond rustle with wind and promise. You close your eyes and remember the biscuit, the cold barrel, the sound of a rat in the dark. You are still hungry, but now it is a hunger for tomorrow. And you wonder, when does survival become living? When does food stop being a memory and become a future? Story 5, Tallow and Tobacco, Civil War Army Rations. The American Civil War was not just a conflict of musket and cannon, it was a conflict of stomachs. For every bullet fired, for every command shouted across the battlefield, there was a soldier somewhere, crouched beside a sputtering fire, chewing on hardtack or blowing ash off a tin cup of weak coffee. The war, waged from 1861 to 1865, brought nearly 3 million men into military service, North and South. And each of them needed to be fed daily, often poorly, and always under threat of supply interruption. The rations they received, whether from Union commissaries or Confederate foraging, tell a deeper story of endurance. A story of meals measured by weight, not flavor. A story of spoiled salt pork, moldy bread, and the ritual of boiling beans while musket fire cracked in the distance. You are one of them now, a soldier, just another name on a muster roll, somewhere between Antietam and exhaustion. Your feet ache, your clothes reek of wood smoke and sweat, and the morning's ration is stuffed in your haversack. And as your stomach growls, you ask yourself not who's winning, but what's for breakfast? What was in a Civil War ration? The U.S. Army established a standard daily ration for Union soldiers early in the war. It included 12 ounces of pork or bacon, or 1 pound of fresh or salt beef, 1 pound of hardtack, 3 large crackers, coffee or tea, usually 1.6 ounces of green or roasted beans, sugar 2.4 ounces, salt 0.64 ounces, vinegar occasionally, soap and candles issued weekly. In addition, the following were issued to small groups, companies, or messes: dried beans or peas, rice or hominy, potatoes when available, molasses or desiccated vegetables, compressed vegetable bricks, often reviled. Confederate rations were similar in intent but weaker in delivery, often consisting only of cornmeal, salt pork if available, molasses, scant coffee, usually replaced with roasted grain or acorns. Supply lines in the South were strained, poorly funded, and frequently disrupted. Soldiers in gray became masters of substitution and of going without. Hardtack, the indestructible bread. The most iconic food of the Civil War was the hardtack cracker, a thick, dry biscuit made from flour, water, and salt, baked until it could break teeth. It was called sheet iron, tooth dullers, worm castles, due to the weevils and maggots often found inside. Soldiers learned to tap and shake their hardtack before eating, dislodging bugs. Others soaked it in hot water, coffee, or stew to soften it. In camp, hardtack became a key ingredient in skilly-galley, broken hardtack soaked in water, fried with pork fat. Sloosh, a Confederate dish of cornmeal dough, wrapped around a rifle ramrod and cooked over fire. Hardtack pudding, crumbled cracker mixed with coffee, sugar, and bacon grease. It wasn't tasty, it was tradition. Salt pork and fresh beef. Salt pork was the default meat ration for both armies. It came in barrels, heavily salted, and often turned rancid before reaching troops. Men would scrape off the salt crust, boil it in water to reduce salinity, fry it in its own fat if they had pans. Fresh beef was issued occasionally but spoiled rapidly without ice or preservation. In hot climates, it often arrived green. Confederate soldiers, especially in later years, were lucky to receive a scrap of pork per day. And yet, they carried it with reverence, knowing it might be the only meat for weeks. Coffee, tobacco, and the comforts of vice. For Union troops, coffee was sacred. It was roasted over open flames, ground with rocks or rifle butts, and brewed in tin cups. Soldiers drank it morning, noon, and night. The caffeine helped with exhaustion and cold. Confederate soldiers, however, lacked regular access to real coffee and used substitutes. Roasted chicory root, parched corn, burnt sweet potatoes, acorns. They joked grimly that it was coffee by name only. Tobacco was another staple, often traded between enemy pickets during unofficial truces. A Union man might trade a plug of chewing tobacco for a cup of Southern cornmeal. These quiet exchanges across lines became strange rituals of mutual deprivation. Communal cooking, campfire kitchens. Cooking was often done in messes, small groups of 5-6 men who pooled rations and took turns cooking. Camp meals included bean soup, boiled beans with bacon or beef, often eaten 3 days in a row. Slapjacks, flour mixed with water and fried on flat rocks or pans. Stews, anything that could be boiled together. Utensils were scarce. Tin cups, spoons, bayonets used as skewers, and tin plates shared communally. There were no napkins, no hand washing, no seasoning beyond salt and maybe pepper. And yet, around the fire with bellies full enough and boots off, these men laughed, argued, and remembered who they were before the war. Foraging and raiding. As the war dragged on, official rations grew scarce. Soldiers adapted. Foraged apples, onions, wild greens, berries. Raided farms for chickens, pigs, and garden vegetables. Baked ash cakes from cornmeal and water. Confederate troops were sometimes ordered to forage in occupied Union territory, adding to resentment among civilians. Union troops in Georgia during Sherman's march were told to live off the land, and they did, burning granaries, seizing livestock, and emptying cellars. It wasn't just war, it was hunger in uniform. A night beside the fire. You sit on a log, stars overhead, rifle beside your feet. In your cup, hot coffee. In your pan, beans and hardtack mashed into a paste. The air smells of sweat and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, a harmonica plays a slow tune. The war continues, but tonight, for a few hours, your belly is quiet. You wonder, what does peace taste like? Will food ever again be something you eat without counting it first? The war drags on. It is now 1863. The battle lines stretch across states. Camps have become semi-permanent towns of canvas and mud. Rations grow thin. Mules stumble under the weight of barrels and crates. Commissary wagons bog down in rain-swollen creeks. And the soldiers, their coats tattered, their boots worn through, eat whatever reaches them. If anything reaches them at all. As you sit in the muck beside a smoldering fire, scraping gray pork fat from the bottom of your tin plate, you realize this war is as much about supply lines as it is about strategy. And more than bullets or bayonets, it is hunger that wins or loses battles. The Army Commissary, feeding millions poorly. The Union Army's Commissary Department, overseen by the U.S. Army Subsistence Bureau, was tasked with feeding over 2 million men over the course of the war. Its responsibilities included contracting food suppliers, shipping and storing rations, managing field kitchens and distribution, preventing theft, fraud, and spoilage, Despite its ambition, the system was overwhelmed. Roads were often impassable. Rail lines were sabotaged. Delays meant that food spoiled in transit or never arrived at all. In the Confederacy, the situation was worse. The Southern supply chain depended on fewer railroads, an economy weakened by blockade and frequent food seizures from citizens. By 1863, many Confederate soldiers were receiving only a handful of cornmeal per day, sometimes mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies. Spoiled meat and swollen bellies. Meat was the most problematic ration. Salt pork and beef were stored in barrels brimming with brine and loaded onto wagons for weeks at a time. Under hot sun or heavy rain, barrels would swell and split, leak brine, spoiling the meat inside, grow worms and maggots in extreme heat. Soldiers described green meat, rotten beef, and pork that stank 3 paces away. And yet it was eaten. Sometimes meat was boiled 3 times to remove the worst of the smell. The result, frequent illness. Dysentery, cholera, camp diarrhea. These illnesses killed more men than bullets. One Union surgeon noted, "We bury as many with shovels as with rifles," making the best of bad rations. Yet soldiers resilient, resourceful, turned even the worst food into something passable. Common creative meals included maggot stew, meat boiled so thoroughly that worms became unnoticeable; hardtack hash, crumbled cracker mixed with grease and sugar; coffee gravy, flour and coffee boiled together as a sauce; rat fricassee, in the worst sieges, rats were trapped and boiled. Some Confederate prisoners even wrote of boiling leather belts, extracting animal fats and chewing the remainder. It was survival, not sustenance. Water, the forgotten hazard. Clean water was rare. Soldiers drank from rivers and creeks, often downstream of latrines or camps. Swampy puddles, filtered through handkerchiefs. Barrels and casks, which often grew algae or turned brackish. Boiling water required firewood, a luxury during long marches or encampments. As a result, many drank water as is, leading to outbreaks of typhoid, dysentery, malaria in the South. In desperation, men added coffee grounds or vinegar to tainted water, trying to kill the worst bacteria. Sometimes it helped, often it didn't. Civilian contributions and care packages. When possible, families sent food from home. Pickled eggs, cured sausages, homemade jams, cakes in tin boxes. These items were precious beyond gold, sometimes passed between men, shared in teaspoons or traded for tobacco. But deliveries were unreliable, packages were stolen by other soldiers, spoiled by the time they arrived, lost during transport. Still, when they came intact, they brought tears to men who had lived months on salt pork and sorrow. The Southern Bread Riot. In April 1863, Confederate civilians in Richmond, Virginia, had had enough. Food shortages and inflation had made bread unaffordable. Dozens of women, armed with clubs and pistols, stormed bakeries and warehouses, shouting, "We want bread or blood." This became known as the Bread Riot, and it revealed how deeply food insecurity had affected not just armies, but entire cities. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, threw coins to the crowd in an attempt to calm them. It didn't work. Soldiers' letters, a chronicle of craving. Soldiers wrote endlessly about food, more than battles, more than politics. A Union soldier. "I dreamt of biscuits last night, big white ones with butter. I woke crying." A Confederate private. "The cornmeal had bugs in it. We toasted it anyway. They added protein." Another wrote home, "Send beans, dear mother, or at least the memory of them." In their letters, food became metaphor, for home, for comfort, for a future where meals are hot and not hurried. A campfire moment. You sit now on your bedroll, back against a tree, fire crackling low. Tonight's meal was salt pork boiled to a gray lump. Your canteen tastes of rust. But someone passed you a piece of bread, a soft one, sent from home. You chew it slowly, holding it like a relic. And you wonder, if war teaches you to eat in silence, what does peace taste like? Will the first real meal after this all ends feel like coming back to life? April 1865. The guns fall silent at Appomattox. Lee surrenders to Grant. Men begin to march home barefoot, gaunt, half-starved. The Union celebrates. The Confederacy grieves. But across both blue and gray, one truth remains. Everyone is hungry. Not just for food, but for normalcy, for warmth, for the sound of spoons in soup that doesn't taste like ash. And yet, even as peace is declared, the long shadow of war hunger stretches on. Because when the war ends, the rations do not improve overnight. Fields lie fallow, roads are broken, animals are dead. And in many southern towns, the concept of a full meal becomes as remote as the cannons now rusting in the hills. Veterans return home to empty tables. Many returning soldiers north and south found their homes burned, looted, overgrown or abandoned, missing family or labor. Fields once full of wheat now sprouted weeds. Chickens, pigs, and cows had been slaughtered long ago. Food supplies were gone. In the South especially, blockades, raids, and foraging policies had left entire counties stripped of sustenance. Former Confederate soldiers, expecting family dinners and warm fires, were met instead with silence, widowhood, or ruined land. In the North, cities like Philadelphia and New York tried to feed returning veterans with public feasts, but for many, it was the first real meal in months. One soldier wrote in his diary, "They gave us bread with butter, hot stew, and coffee that wasn't burnt. I wept into the bowl. The freed people and food." For the 4 million enslaved people newly freed by the war's end, food became both a symbol of independence and a matter of immediate survival. Plantation kitchens, once run on enslaved labor, collapsed. Union armies had often fed freed people in refugee camps, but with the war's end, those rations stopped. Many freed families attempted to cultivate small plots of land, but with few tools, no seed, and scarce livestock, hunger persisted. The Freedmen's Bureau attempted to distribute food, mostly cornmeal, salt pork, and rice, but corruption and poor logistics limited reach. Many communities organized mutual aid networks, where food was pooled and shared. Still, stories tell of entire families living on pokeweed, dandelion greens, and pond fish for weeks. The politics of post-war food. The U.S. government created new supply chains to support reconstruction, but these efforts were often delayed, underfunded, or resisted by local authorities. In Congress, debates erupted. Should former Confederates receive federal food assistance? Should freed people be fed through military posts? Was charity sustainable, or should people simply be told to plant and wait? In the meantime, communities created soup kitchens, often run by churches and women's aid societies. Menus were humble: cornmeal mush with molasses, dried bean soup, lard-fried biscuits, salt pork stews. No spice, no luxury. But for the war-weary, warmth and fullness mattered more than taste. Army rations become civilian staples. In many homes, especially in the South, Army rations became the new normal. Salt pork continued as a primary protein. Cornmeal replaced wheat flour, which remained expensive. Hardtack, stored in barrels and repurposed, was soaked and fried for years after the war. Even Confederate coffee substitutes like roasted chicory and sweet potatoes remained common in households into the 1880s. Soldiers had brought their wartime diets home. And in poverty, what had been emergency food became tradition. Recipes from the ashes. In the years after the war, cookbooks began to include army bean soup, dried navy beans, fatback, salt and vinegar, hard biscuit stew, crumbled hardtack softened with broth and onions, slush cakes, cornmeal and lard fried flat, served with molasses if available. Many veterans refused to eat these foods again. Others found comfort in their familiarity. One former Union soldier remarked, "I cursed hardtack every day of the war, and yet now, if I smell it baking, I remember my brothers." Memory and the meaning of food. The Civil War left deep scars, emotional, physical, and dietary. Many former soldiers developed lifelong food anxieties, hoarding rations or eating quickly, inability to throw food away, obsessive sharing at tables. Meals became sacred. Families passed down war recipes not for taste but for remembrance. In Confederate households, ash cake night became a family tradition, baking cornmeal cakes in hearth embers, sharing stories of survival. In Union homes, bean soup was served every April in memory of fallen comrades. The food of war course, improvised, and bare had become the food of legacy. One last meal by the fire. The war is over. Your uniform is folded away. You sit with your family again, the house dark but warm. On the table, a bowl of bean stew, a tin plate of biscuits, a cup of black coffee. Outside, crickets sing. And though it is quiet, your hands still reach for your tin mess kit. Your body still listens for the bugle call. You chew slowly, the stew thick and familiar. And you wonder, if war makes you hunger, does peace ever make you full? Story 6. Dried plums in clay pots. A day in a Roman army camp. You are in Gaul or Syria or Britannia. It is hard to say exactly, for the postings blur together dusty roads, distant hills, leather tents, and the ever-present clang of the smithy hammer. You are a Roman legionary, a cog in the immense military engine that spans the known world. Your gladius is sharp, your shield is oiled, but what occupies your thoughts on this quiet, watchful morning is not war or glory. It is food. Because today, like most days, begins and ends with bread, coarse, gritty, and filling. Around it, a rotation of olive oil, dried fruits, garum, and lentils, served from earthen pots and tin plates. This is not the feast of emperors. This is not banquet food whispered through history. This is the ordinary meal of the Roman rank and file, the fuel that built an empire. Camp life, the backbone of the Roman army. Each Roman legion built its own castrum, a fortified military camp, at nearly every stop. The layout was standardized. A central via Praetoria, Main Street. A command area. Rows of tent blocks, contubernia for soldiers. Latrines, storage areas, blacksmiths, and most importantly granaries and kitchens. Within this order, men lived in groups of 8, sharing a leather tent, a fire, and food. Their daily meals were not cooked by camp followers or professional chefs. Legionaries themselves prepared their food, often taking turns, or assigning the duty to the least injured or newest recruit. Cooking was done in bronze pots or ceramic vessels, over open fires fueled by whatever wood or dried dung could be scavenged. The ubiquity of bread. At the center of every meal was panis militaris, military bread. Made from wheat flour, water, and salt, it came in several forms. Libum, small, thick loaves baked directly on hot stones. Bucellatum, twice-baked hard biscuit for long marches. Pools, a porridge made by boiling wheat or barley flour into a thick gruel. Flour was often issued raw. Each contubernium received a daily grain allotment which had to be ground by hand using a quernstone, mixed with water and salt or ashes for leavening, baked on hot tiles, ashes, or in portable clay ovens. The bread could be soaked in wine to soften it, spread with garum, a fermented fish sauce, dipped in olive oil or vinegar. It was a process and a ritual. Oil, vinegar, and garum. Alongside bread, Roman soldiers received flavoring agent substances meant to preserve calories and provide vital nutrients. Olive oil, used for cooking, dressing pulses, and lighting lamps. Vinegar, mixed with water to form pasca, a sour drink that killed bacteria. Garum, a pungent fermented fish sauce, shipped in amphorae from Spain, Gaul, or North Africa. Garum was so essential that armies marched with crates of it. It was umami before umami had a name, adding flavor to bland stews and boiled grains. One soldier wrote in a graffiti inscription, "Bread is hard, garum makes it live again." Pulses and lentils. Legumes were a staple. Lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, boiled into stews, mashed into pastes, or eaten cold with vinegar. Pulses provided protein and fiber essential for long marches and siege endurance. Cooking beans could take hours. In cooler climates, soldiers buried pots in coals and let them simmer slowly, checking between watches. These stews were seasoned with garlic and onions, coriander or cumin, if available, leftover fat from pork or mutton. In one preserved cooking manual, a soldier writes of boiling chickpeas until they burst, and then adding vinegar until the pot hisses. Not fine dining, but deeply satisfying. Cheese, fruit, and the odd bit of meat. When available, soldiers received cheese, usually hard, salted varieties that traveled well. Dried fruit, figs, prunes, dried plums, raisins. Nuts, almonds, and walnuts. Occasional fresh meat, pork, goat, or even dormice. These were rare. Meat was not daily fare. When issued, it was boiled with lentils, grilled on skewers, preserved as salt pork or smoked sausage. But the prized treasures were fruit. Figs soaked in wine. Dried prunes, eaten slowly before nightfall. Apples or pears, when in season and local farmers could be persuaded to sell. Pasca, the legionaries' drink. While wine was reserved for officers, regular legionaries drank pasca, a blend of water, vinegar, sometimes herbs like oregano or thyme. Pasca was sour but safe to drink, as the vinegar killed microbes. Legionaries would carry it in goatskin flasks, sipping it between drills or during long marches. Many claimed it kept them cool in heat and alert in battle. A military surgeon once wrote, "It cleans the stomach, the wounds, and the soul." Rationing and logistics. The Roman army moved with enormous supply trains, including mules and wagons, portable mills, clay amphorae filled with oil and garum, sacks of grain and salt. But every campaign stretched these lines. If supplies failed, soldiers would forage local food, grapes, roots, wild greens, buy from provincial markets, or if desperate, plunder. The Roman war machine was sustained by systematic logistics, grain stored in granaries, roads built for wagons, and the discipline to cook even in mud. A quiet evening in camp. You sit in your contubernium, legs outstretched, bowl in your lap. In it, lentil porridge with a dash of oil, a smear of garum, and a dried plum softened by heat. The bread is coarse and dry, but dipped in pasca, it softens. A fellow soldier sharpens his blade nearby. Another hums an old Etruscan melody. The air smells of sweat, iron, and garlic. You chew slowly, and you wonder. How many empires were built on the back of a stew pot? Is conquest made by sword or by supper? The horn sounds. You wake in a tent still heavy with the scent of smoke and iron. It's not yet light, but your contubernium begins to stir. Boots thud, querns grind. Somewhere nearby, a mule kicks its wooden cart, restless. Today is a marching day. And for a Roman legionary, that means not only arms and armor but sustenance on the move. Bread must be packed, pasca refilled, meat if there is any salted tight in a leather pouch. Everything depends on careful planning. And failure means hunger and collapse. Because the power of the Roman Empire was not just in its soldiers, but in its supply chains. The supply train, a military lifeline. Behind every Roman legion marched a complex system of logistical support, including pack mules and oxen. Each unit relied on hundreds of animals to transport grain, oil, water, tools, tents, and weapons. Carro ballisti, ox-drawn carts for artillery. Grain carts protected by mounted auxiliaries. Field engineers who ensured roads and bridges could support movement. While the army could live off the land to an extent, success depended on stockpiled supplies delivered consistently and guarded jealously. Every soldier carried grain, usually a few days' worth, around 1.5 kg daily. Hard biscuits, bucellatum. Vinegar flask. Cheese or dried fruit when available. Officers and engineers coordinated ration intervals, typically 10-day periods, requiring constant monitoring of consumption, spoilage, and resupply. Grain first always. Wheat was the gold standard. If wheat wasn't available, the legions would tolerate barley or spelt, though these were less desirable. During prolonged campaigns, army bakers known as pistors sometimes accompanied legions with portable clay ovens to mass-produce loaves, but most soldiers still ground, kneaded, and baked their own. Rations were calculated meticulously. Modius tilde 6, 5 kg of grain per man per week. Milled on-site using hand querns. Baked as ash cakes, sometimes covered in leaves or parchment to keep off the dirt. If fuel was low, soldiers made raw dough cakes, sun-dried during hot marches. These were like a cross between jerky and cardboard, indigestible, but long-lasting. Water on the march. If food was important, water was vital. Roman commanders planned campaigns based on access to water. Rivers, springs, or even dew collection were noted on military maps, and each cohort carried water skins, clay amphorae, wooden buckets. Soldiers also used woolen cloths to filter water from streams and lakes. They flavored it with vinegar, creating pasca, or added wine dregs when available. In desert campaigns, like in the East, armies marched by night to conserve water and reduce sweat loss. Sand was dug for wells, and cisterns were built into fortresses to collect rain. Spoilage, waste, and survival strategies. Spoilage was inevitable. The enemy was not just hunger but moisture, heat, rodents, insects. Food was stored in sealed sacks, suspended from poles or packed in wax-sealed boxes when possible. But mules kicked crates, carts overturned in rain, rats chewed their way through bags. Sometimes soldiers found themselves with rotten grain, sour oil, and swarming figs. Rather than waste these, soldiers became masters of adaptation. Spoiled figs were boiled down to syrup and mixed with vinegar. Moldy cheese was shaved clean and softened with oil. Insect-infested flour was sifted and toasted into a crude pancake. Survival meant using everything. Fueling the fire. One of the least glamorous and most necessary daily tasks, gathering fuel. Wood was needed to bake bread, boil water, cook pulses, forge weapons and armor. In forested regions, soldiers formed wood-cutting details. In dry climates, they burned dry dung, olive press waste, old leather, cloth, or broken shields. Fuel shortages forced innovation. Soldiers buried cooking pots in fire pits, creating primitive slow cookers. Rocks were superheated and dropped into water-filled pots to boil stews. Meals were shared, reducing overall cooking needs. Salt, fat in the fight for calories. Fat was precious. It flavored food, healed wounds, and kept lamps burning. Salt was a currency, both a preservative and a reward. Roman armies sourced salt from sea evaporation pans, mines in Gaul and Spain, trade with local tribes. Fat came from rendered pork or goat meat, olive oil when possible, leftover marrow from boiled bones. Salted fat or lard mixed with herbs was spread on bread or used to coat meat before storage. Rations were designed not for taste but for caloric density. A legionary could burn 4,000 calories per day on the march. The soldiers' ingenuity. Despite the tight rations and harsh conditions, soldiers often cooked with flair, especially when they had free time. Examples of field recipes from Roman texts and archaeological finds include pulse juliana, a grain stew with onions, herbs, vinegar, and olive oil. Lucanian sausage, cured pork with pepper, cumin, and bay leaf. Stuffed dormice, rare but popular in peacetime garrisons, dormice filled with nuts and herbs. These weren't everyday meals, but they show that Roman soldiers, like all people, found joy in food even when it was hard-earned. The night before the next march. The stars rise over the camp, fires crackle, a pot of chickpea porridge simmers, sweetened with wine-soaked prunes and spiced with a pinch of cumin smuggled from the last town. You eat with your fingers, scraping every last bit from the bowl. You think not of conquests or borders, but of the sack of grain tied to your hip. And you wonder, did the empire fall from swords or from the slow fray of the supply line? You are no longer in camp, you are marching. 20 miles today, maybe more tomorrow. The sun hangs low. Your sandals are worn smooth. Every bone in your back aches under the weight of your sarcina, your soldier's pack. But still you press on. Because you are Roman, and because you carry not just a sword and shield, but the calories that will build a wall, hold a border, or claim a province. And yet, as centuries roll on, the greatest force to ever walk Europe will eventually falter. Not from outside alone, but because the empire's kitchens fell silent and its granaries crumbled. Food built Rome, and food in the end helped unravel it. Grain and the growth of empire. Rome's imperial success rested on its ability to feed people at scale: soldiers, citizens, slaves, and administrators across thousands of miles. From the 1st century BCE through the 2nd century CE, the Roman state mastered logistical feats. Annona, the state grain supply, organized fleets of ships to carry wheat from Egypt, Africa, and Sicily to Rome and military frontiers. A system of granaries, horia, dotting roads, cities, and forts stored months of surplus grain. Roads and milestones ensured wagon traffic could move food quickly and regularly. For the army, these systems meant predictable rations, seasonal provisions, the ability to remain in garrisons for years. Legions were fed with remarkable consistency. This allowed them to hold territories with fewer numbers because starvation was not their enemy. When the system cracks, but from the 3rd century CE onward, cracks formed. The reasons were many. Political instability. With over 20 emperors in 50 years, central planning faltered. Increased invasions. Frontier regions became contested, cutting off local grain sources. Decline of road maintenance, trade slowed, grain spoiled in transport. Plague and climate events reduced yields and collapsed local food systems. The army, once fed by global networks, became dependent on local foraging and tax in kind, where farmers had to surrender a share of produce. Soldiers began to plunder communities that failed to meet quotas, rely on corrupt quartermasters to secure rations, consume inferior grains, millet, barley, or even acorns. The diet narrowed, morale frayed. The impact on military effectiveness. When armies are hungry, discipline suffers. Roman historians noted increased desertions, mutinies over missed rations, reluctance to campaign in late seasons or cold regions. One report from the 4th century notes a garrison in Gaul where bread was made from tree bark and pond moss. Another from Egypt describes soldiers, too weakened by diarrhea to hold their spears. Roman generals began recruiting more barbarian auxiliaries, sometimes offering food alone as payment. This changed army structure and loyalty. When Rome could no longer promise bread, it could no longer promise control. Civilian famine and urban collapse. It wasn't just soldiers. In Rome itself, the grain dole, subsidized bread for citizens, was disrupted repeatedly in the 3rd and 4th centuries. People fled cities, riots broke out, grain ships from Egypt were lost to pirates or storms. In rural regions, farmers abandoned fields under tax pressure. Slaves revolted over poor rations. Droughts created multi-year famines. In the West, the infrastructure of food collapsed. Feeding an empire became impossible. From legion to local militia. As central food supplies dwindled, the Roman army devolved into regional garrisons. Some were self-sustaining, growing their own barley, raising pigs, and building bread ovens. Others foraged permanently, taxing or looting local populations. Some formed private militias, loyal more to landowners than Rome. One archaeologist studying a late Roman camp in Britain found storage pits for wild grains, suggesting even formal legions were relying on hunter-gatherer supplements. The image of the professional Roman soldier faded, and with it the imperial dream. The final loaves. Even as the empire fell in the 5th century, some Roman forts still made daily bread. In Vindolanda, a fort along Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists uncovered quernstones worn smooth by decades of grinding, burned layers of barley ash from open hearths, cracked amphorae with remnants of garum, a letter from a soldier requesting more oil, and figs if the gods are kind. They ate to the end. They baked even as the world shrank around them. Food was the last holdout of civilization. One more bite before the fall. Night falls over your final campaign. You've been issued coarse barley bread soaked in vinegar, a few dried figs sticky from heat, and a stew of lentils and pork fat bubbling in a cracked pot. You sit on a ruined wall. The fort is emptying. The legions are disbanding. The grain ships no longer come. You take a bite. It is bland. It is bitter, but it is food. And you wonder, did Rome fall when the Visigoths breached her gates, or when the ovens went cold?